zeggen. Want er wordt aangifte tegen je gedaan. En misschien zijn er zelfs D66-officieren die het een proces aandoen. Maar de vrijheid van meningsuiting is een groot goed. En we hebben niets gezegd wat niet mag. We hebben niets gezegd wat niet klopt. Dus ik vraag aan jullie. Willen jullie in deze stad en in Nederland meer of minder Marokkanen? Dan gaan we dat regelen. Mag ik nog één keer een applaus en het woord geven aan onze lijsttrekker Leon de Jong.
Okay, so welcome everyone to Meet the World, which is an interactive talk show about current world affairs. So for the topic of today, hate speech, we had a fellow media member writing an issue about it. So she's Anna Silva Salazar, a liberal arts student as well. And just some rules before we start. If you have a question, feel free to ask it at any time, and the microphone will be handed to you. And we have two guest speakers today, Ms. Van Noorloos and Mr. Regt. So please introduce yourselves and welcome.
Thank you. So my name is Marloes van Noorloos. I'm assistant professor of criminal law at Tilburg University. And I wrote my PhD about hate speech in the Netherlands and in England and Wales, and compared these two countries. After that, I've done new research also in the field of hate speech, in the field of genocide denial, these kinds of issues. And I think the reason why I was asked to come here had to do with a research project about defamation of religion, insult of religion, which already sounds maybe a bit strange. How can you insult a religion? You can insult religious persons, of course. But the idea was because the Dutch government abolished the law on blasphemy last year. And then the Senate wanted to know, well, is then every expression about religion, does every expression about religion now fall under freedom of expression? Or are there still certain things that you can prohibit in this field? And that's the research that I've conducted. So, shall I give you the floor first and then we can say something content-wise? Or yeah.
Sure. So I'll keep my introduction very short. My name is Herman de Regt. I'm an associate professor in philosophy, and I've been asked this afternoon to defend the freedom of speech, or free speech, and I will do so. But just to make things clear, my own view on the matter of free speech is more nuanced. Basically, my view, of course, boils down to the idea that there is no such thing as a right to freedom of speech, as I do not think there are basic human rights at all. Not to mention that I do not believe there is something like freedom, although there is, of course, a strong illusion of free will. I'm a pragmatist, therefore a non-essentialist. I find myself to be a defender of science, where science looks like the most reliable way to learn what works and what doesn't in our overall pathetic attempts to survive in an extremely complex and ever-changing world. From this perspective, my own perspective, the freedom of speech is just another tool, a tool we use to coordinate our activities. Sometimes the social and historical contexts will lead us to the idea that it's wiser to put constraints on the freedom of speech, but then again, in different changed conditions, we can as easily, hopefully, lift these constraints as we learn. Well, as you can see, I'm a man of no principles. I do, however, have the tendency to stick to one rule of life, namely keep track of the lessons learned. If you want to quarrel with me over this heuristic, I do not want to rebut your arguments, I simply wait until you cease to exist. As the chances are high that without keeping track of the lessons learned, you will soon die. But today, after Marloes has made her statement, I will try to defend the freedom of speech.
Thank you. Yeah, what can I say against this? Well, I do believe in human rights. I'm also a human rights activist. But in this field of hate speech, that's not so easy because, well, which right do you propagate? There are different human rights that may be at stake here. And, the line between hate speech and free speech is, of course, very thin sometimes. Can you, for instance, say you find Christianity a stupid religion? Can you say that Christian people are stupid people, or that you encourage all Christians to voluntarily leave the Netherlands, which is something like what Geert Wilders actually said about Moroccan people? So today, what my research expertise is not about what is morally acceptable. It's about what is legally acceptable, and that is quite a difference. So I focus on criminal law. What can you prohibit by criminal law? And that's quite difficult because criminal law is a very harsh measure, actually. You can jail people with it. You can use all kinds of enforcement powers. And maybe most important of all, it's a symbolic means for the state to say what you're doing here is unacceptable behavior. What you're doing is something that goes against us all as a society, not only against this individual person, but against society as a whole. And that's the symbolic power of the criminal law. And because of these characteristics, criminal law, as we always say as criminal lawyers, is an ultimum remedium. It's a means that you should only use if it's not possible to use alternatives. And of course you also have the human right to freedom of expression, which may put limits to the power of the state to prohibit all kinds of speeches. Like in Russia, there was this proposal by Putin to criminalize propaganda for homosexuality. If the European Court of Human Rights would see this proposal, I don't think they would leave this in place. This would certainly be a restriction that goes too far. But sometimes it's possible to restrict freedom of speech. Maybe we can have the slide with Article 10 ECHR. Yes. So, for instance, under this human rights treaty, the European Convention on Human Rights, everyone has the right to freedom of expression, but it also comes with duties and responsibilities. So sometimes a state can restrict your right to freedom of expression, but it has to be clearly in the law. It has to serve a legitimate interest, and it has to be necessary in a democratic society. And that actually means it must be proportional. You cannot just restrict everything. You have to have really good reasons. And in legal theory, you find some of these really good reasons, or, well, that's up to you to say if these reasons are really good reasons to prohibit hate speech. But I will just mention a few of them and we can have a discussion about it. So one of the reasons you could have for prohibiting hate speech is that, it leads to negative imaging about certain ethnic groups, about certain religious groups in the eyes of other people. So that is not yet about the impact it makes on you as a person belonging to this group, but it's really about Wilders saying something and influencing the general public, so that maybe the general public will eventually start, maybe even violent attacks or discrimination. If you're an employer and you hear these things and they have an influence on you, then what will you do if you have, say, a Muslim trying to get a job in your company? So this already also indicates that it's quite an indirect link. So it's not a direct link between this speech of Wilders and this act of discrimination. There is a lot of messages together that may lead to people getting the idea that a certain group is inferior. So we can talk a bit more about that, like, yeah, how is racism caused exactly, and what can we do with the criminal law here? Can we do something at all? And a second important reason, and then I'll stop, is the direct effect on people themselves. I can imagine that well, racist speech also leads to fear by the people who are targeted, fear that maybe one day they will be attacked. Yeah, the fear that people will get bad ideas about you, that they will do something, that they will act upon it, and just feelings of inferiority, because another person, especially if they do it directly, they say something directly in your face. Research has shown that this really leads to harmed feelings of inferiority. And I already see a question here.
How would this drive with religious rights? For example, my mother is one of these extreme Christians, the ones that are like anti-homosexuality, anti-everything, abortion. But how would that drive? Because what she's saying is, would be hate speech if it was against an ethnic group, or is hate speech. How does that drive? Because you like because there's an obvious justification for forbidding that, but you're also getting rid of the freedom of religion. How does that work in, say, Dutch law?
Yeah, that's a very important question indeed. I think the arguments in favor of freedom of expression I left for Herman Regt, because my position is also somewhat more in the middle. But so the freedom of religion indeed, and the freedom of expression may put limits, of course, to what you can prohibit. For instance, mostly these laws, like in the Netherlands, are only about public speech. So what people say in the private spaces, such as their house, is of course free. But in public, sometimes it can be prohibited, and there you have to make the balance between, well, sometimes things are important to say, of course, things about religion, criticism of certain practices within the religion, and I certainly wouldn't say these should be prohibited, this type of speech. It's also an interesting question with homophobic speech. In the Netherlands, you've seen some expressions by Orthodox Christians about well, saying something like being gay is just as bad as stealing or something. One of the politicians from these parties said something like this. Then he was prosecuted, but he was acquitted because the court said, well, it's very important what the context is behind your speech. And if your speech is actually an expression of your religious conviction, then it becomes a bit more difficult to convict someone, because you must also be able to express these, even though they may sometimes be offensive to people. But these are things that, according to the people saying it, emanate from the Bible. Well, I wouldn't necessarily agree with them, but yeah, you have to be able to say this, the court found.
Considering the speech by Mr. Wilders, would you categorize that as a crime? Is it allowed because he doesn't say Führer himself, but he instigates the audience to do so? So how does that leave the situation? Well, the interesting thing about Wilders is that, of course, he's been prosecuted before. He's been acquitted of lots of different speeches, which are in many ways not so different from what he's saying here. So he said, for instance, sorry for this speech. I mean, it's not my speech, but I have to use these examples here. The number of Muslims is growing with aggressive elements, imperialism, a conflict is going on, blah, blah, blah. And his film Fitna, of course, maybe you've seen parts of it, is also rather harsh. And there, well, what the court said was, if you for convicting someone of hate speech, you need a power-strengthening element in the speech.
So it must be a very provocative speech, really provoking people to go and act, to do something. And that's why in these cases, most of the speeches were in newspapers, and he actually said other nuanced things later on in the same interview. So they were not as provocative, according to the court. But now, I guess, chances are quite high that it will be different, and that the courts cannot really use this argument anymore when they look at this film, because it's obviously quite provocative. And it was not only meant for his own people of his own party who already have these same views. It was broadcasted, and of course he knew that, because everything he does is for the media. That's something that might play a role in the future case against him.
Shall I try to bring forward the case for the freedom of speech, an unrestricted, radical form of freedom of speech? I don't know whether you think that's okay?
Yeah, of course. Feel free. Yeah,
okay. Because I'd like to defend Geert Wilders. Not just Geert Wilders, but also Joseph Goebbels. So, for instance, I would say a radical freedom of speech would for instance mean that the dreadful and with hindsight, of course, aggressive and tragic content of the speech by Joseph Goebbels when he introduces Adolf Hitler as a new Chancellor of Germany in 1933 in the Berliner Sportpalast. It's a dreadful and despicable content, but the content as such, of course, is no reason to forbid Goebbels to speak out his national-socialistische heart. So perhaps we can, it's only 1.5 minutes or so.
In Deutschland und jenseits der deutschen Grenzen die Rede des Reichskanzlers Adolf Hitlers zu Gehör bekommen werden. Wenn die jüdische Presse sich darüber beschwert, dass die nationalsozialistische Bewegung nun den Reichskanzler auf alle deutschen Sender sprechen lässt, so können wir darauf nur zur Antwort geben, wie ihr es uns vorgemacht, so machen wir es jetzt. Und wenn die jüdischen Zeitungen heute glauben, auf versteckte Drohungen die nationalsozialistische Bewegung einschüchtern zu können, wenn sie heute glauben, unsere Notverordnungen umgehen zu dürfen, sie sollen sich hüten. Einmal wird unsere Geduld zu Ende sein und dann wird den Juden das freche Lügen mal gestoppt werden.
Yeah, that will do. So, terrible speech. However, there's no reason to prohibit people like Goebbels to express their thoughts and threats in front of an audience of 20 million people, even though the content is absolutely and completely despicable. So many will say this introduction was only one further step in the preparatory process of the attempted extermination of the Jewish people. They will claim it definitely contributed to the killing and murder of millions of Jews in concentration camps like Auschwitz-Birkenau. And surely every humanely thinking human will argue that this is something we do not want to happen again, and therefore there is no limitless freedom of speech. However, and still, it sounds harsh, I know, but the bottom line is that it was not the speech by Goebbels that murdered the Jews. The reason why we ought to admit Goebbels-like speeches is because they obey the rule that no physical harm by itself is done by it. In 1859, a wonderful year, the publication of Darwin's masterpiece, but also the publication year of On Liberty by John Stuart Mill and his wife Harriet Mill, who died a year before, introduced the so-called and often debated no harm principle. Here's the principle. Perhaps we can read it just. Can we read it or leave it like that? I mean, it's a wonderful quote that kind of gives you the argument why there must be something like the freedom of speech. The object of this essay, Mill says, is to assert one very simple principle, and as entitled to govern absolutely the dealings of society with the individual in the way of compulsion and control, whether the means used be physical force in the form of legal penalties or the moral coercion of public opinion. And that principle is that the sole end for which mankind are warranted individually or collectively in interfering with the liberty of action of any of their number is self-protection. That the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. I know a lot can be said about this no harm principle. Marloes knows a lot more about this principle than I do, how it plays out in law. For now, I simply accept this principle. And I assume that harm here means physical harm, not just mere offense. For now, I simply conclude that words do not kill or physically harass, despite the romantic idea, of course, that the pen can be sharper than the sword. I'd rather have the pen than the sword. It is only people that write and speak, that's true, but it's also people that harass and kill, not words. In our society, we do not allow freedom of murder, but we ought to allow unconditional freedom of speech. And both John Stuart Mill and Harriet Taylor Mill give arguments for this freedom of speech. And I'd like to raise two arguments, and then I'll stop. The first argument is that one of the most important reasons why we should not silence any opinion is the very fact that that silenced opinion might be true. To deny that the opinion might be true is to assume our own infallibility. And that's something that we do not want to do. And perhaps the second most important reason why we should not silence opinions is that even if we think that we are true, that we are right, even if the received opinion is the whole truth, unless that opinion is vigorously and earnestly contested, it will by most of those who could receive it be held in a manner of prejudice, rather than a well-argued and well-reasoned judgment. So I side for this afternoon, of course, I side with the Mills, and I'd like to say that society has the opportunity to become a better society only if we guard the unrestricted freedom of speech or expression of opinion. So let the Theo van Goghs, Geert Wilders, Leon de Winters, Dries van Achts, but also David Irvings, the Joseph Goebbels, the Danish imam Ahmed Abu Laban, who instigated the whole cartoon discussion in Denmark, or any extremist religious people, or religious peoples as such, for that matter, speak out their minds. Right? Let us make sure that our society is strong enough to keep this freedom intact, and let us make sure our society is strong enough to tolerate freedom of speech. So always remember, I guess, that what you hold true for yourself, in this case, always be able to speak out your mind, you need also hold true for others. Today we may be in the lead, tomorrow we may be the suppressed. Freedom of speech ought to hold for everyone, always and everywhere. Whenever the freedom of speech is restricted, democracy is under threat. Whenever democracy is under threat, chances are high that the level of suffering will rise. And that is something we do not want to happen.
Okay, and a question for the audience. Should freedom of speech be regulated or not? Like, I'd like to see some different opinions. Yes?
Well, I agree with you, Professor, if you are one, sorry. But like Voltaire said, I may not agree necessarily with what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. And I think that is, that should be the standard for freedom of speech and expression, which, in my personal opinion, the one true place where you actually have full freedom of expression is the United States of America. Because, I was just about to actually ask a question before this, before you went into the Goebbels bit, and I was essentially going to ask, is historical revisionism a form of hate speech, because in the sort of jurisprudence of the European Court, it kind of has helped to have been hate speech. While at the same time, it presents, like I'm just going to take one example, Katyn, the massacre of 44,000 Polish officers, which during the International Military Tribunal was blamed by the Soviets on the National Socialist German Army, which they took the fall for, which contributed the whole image of the Nazi, right? I'm not saying that it was just Katyn, but it's part of a whole greater sort of things which lend to the lack of credibility or the lack of legitimacy or the delegitimization of the International Military Tribunal and therefore international criminal law afterwards. So raising that sort of question, is it really hate speech? Because it's like you said, like Mill says, when you're suppressing the truth, you're suppressing the truth. You're oppressing someone.
Yes, it's a very important topic. I think in the Netherlands, to start with, is it hate speech? In the Netherlands and under the European Convention on Human Rights, it is sometimes called hate speech. And the argumentation is then that if you say the Holocaust hasn't happened, then you're actually accusing the victims of lying, the victims and their next of kin and the whole group. And that adds insult to injury, is the argumentation. But of course, you can say a lot against that if you look at historical revisionism in general. After mass conflict, after genocide, gross human rights violations, there's always a process, a very slow process, where people start to know what happened, they start to talk about it, historians start to write about it, and new truths come up, new facts about what happened, the example you gave is a very important example here, because Russia also actually tried to sort of rewrite history in this example, and there you see the role of the state can be a very bad. States can use it in very bad ways. They can use these laws to put forward their own vision of history, which is not necessarily the right vision, but to get legitimacy with their own view of history. So these laws are very problematic, although. You could also make an argument when you really speak only about denying the facts of the Holocaust, denying the gas chambers, then I can imagine it can be offensive for people who actually lived through the atrocities. It can be very offensive if this is a reason to prohibit it. Maybe only until the further generations come up and they have to really talk about it, and the offense maybe only should count for one generation that has lived through it.
Well, what did you say then? And this is just one very brief question, and you can answer very briefly if you want. Doesn't this show that going the legal way or the way of criminal law is not the right way to deal with hate speeches?
Yes, I tend to agree with that, but could you elaborate on why the criminal law is not the right?
Well, I'd like to defend the point of view that with regard to freedom of speech, of course, then the absolute opposite of freedom of speech is to think of the law to regulate speeches. Yeah. So freedom of speech means that hate speeches are allowed. Taking law as a last resort, as you said, even as a last resort, it might do more harm than good.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with you there, actually, that some Holocaust denial trials have shown exactly what you say, that if you have a criminal trial about this, even if you would intuitively say, well, this is really so unacceptable, maybe it would be good to regulate it, but then you have this criminal trial, and the defendants, they get up and say, well, let us ask some witnesses, some survivors, to tell about their experiences, voices in concentration camps. This is actually what happened in Canada during a trial of, I think it was even David Irving, or I'm not sure anymore. And then the trial became all about contesting exactly those facts. And the defendant actually sort of succeeded in the eyes of some people in casting doubt about these facts that everybody actually accepts. So in that sense, pragmatically, indeed, sure, the criminal law is a very bad mechanism to deal with this. But in general, yeah, there should be other ways to deal with it.
Yeah, but I was wondering, besides the pragmatic way, like, you cannot silence people. Like, you can make a law that Wilders cannot say what he says, but you cannot stop him from saying it. And isn't this very paradoxically that if you get a lawsuit about what he said, that he gets so much more publicity than he already had, and isn't that his whole goal? And what then is it worth to have a law prohibiting what he says if it only gives him more publicity? And besides that, another question as well is that is it that bad to that, you know, isn't it good that some people sometimes say ridiculous things, like what happened as well last week in the second chamber? The guy said that Islam and that mosque should disappear and that blah blah. Isn't that a good thing, because there's a whole new generation standing up that actually starts thinking about that and fights that?
Yeah, I completely agree with you that in an ideal situation we should be able to have this debate and to all have rational opinions about it and say, well, this is nonsense, but it should be said. And but at the same time, I'm afraid when you look at well, what has happened in the Netherlands since freedom of speech became, well, much bigger, at least, maybe not legally, but in society since 2001, approximately, since Fortuyn, thereafter Wilders, of course. Much more is said in public debates. Also, racism has come much more out in the open. And I do think many people are able to differentiate between good and bad arguments and to say, well, this is nonsense and we should have a debate about it, and then we can all conclude that it's nonsense. But at the same time, I do have the idea, especially when I talk to people belonging to the groups concerned, who say, well, since that time, I've experienced much more racism in the Netherlands actually than before, because before it was more closeted. It was there, of course, and now because some politicians give the idea that, well, it's okay to say these things, it's okay to always speak about Moroccan criminals, etc. Not only Wilders, also the Labour Party does that actually. Yeah, if it's more out in the open and politicians give this example, then people tend, I think, to feel more free to use it in their lives as well, and become sometimes convinced that there is something to these arguments. But at the same time, I don't think the criminal law is necessarily a good way to counter this, but I think it should be much more harshly countered by other politicians and by society as a whole.
Can I just add one more aspect to your answer? Because you are referring to what happened in the in Parliament in the past week, and then you say, look, might it not be a good case, a good illustration that there is a member of Parliament saying stupid things? There's a new generation rethinking everything that's being said. They are educated. They can assess these kinds of statements or opinions themselves, and so we hope for the best. So the point is that we hope for the best is something that you know, that's the risks that we are prepared to take. But the other thing that we might do something about is to educate. So a society with a unrestricted freedom of speech is, according to me, today, something that we should strive for. But it goes along with a really good educational system, right? It goes along with a good educational system. It comes along only in a society that has media that take responsibility, right? To brief the public in a good way, in a balanced way, about different opinions. So there are, restrictions on society as such if you want to keep up the unrestricted freedom of speech. So you cannot defend something like an unconditional freedom of speech if you don't have these things in order. Yeah.
Okay, last remarks, please.
Yeah?
Yeah.
My question is, Marloes, a lot of your arguments seem to revolve around the fact that you might offend someone if you say something. But isn't it not, actually I'm going to ask two about that. The first part, isn't it not in Dutch law, or in most countries' law, that you do not have a right, you have a right to offend, and that's part of free speech, but you do not have a right not to be offended? And then, secondly, my personal view of it is that I believe that as long as you're not inciting people to violence, you can say whatever you want. But then, like, isn't the risk of restricting, or trying to restrict hate speech, that legitimate political discourse is silenced? Because obviously, if there's, like Geert Wilders is 24%, there is a perceived problem. I'm not saying there is a problem. There's a perceived problem, and people will keep thinking it no matter what you tell them they can or cannot say. So what are your views on these two issues?
Yeah, thank you. On the offense issue, it's indeed true. There is, well, you could say a right to offend, or at least the right to freedom of expression includes the right to offend, shock, or disturb. That's also what the European Court continuously says, and I agree with that. So the most important arguments that I made, well, in favor of restricting freedom of expression would be the negative imaging idea, that it may eventually lead to violence. So that is related to incitement to violence, but it is more of an indirect incitement. So if you say really harsh things about certain groups, it may eventually lead to violence against them. I mean, I'm defending this position now. I don't think it's always a really good argument, but in some situations it can be. And psychological harm was the second point that I made, and I think psychological harm to people is, well, just a bit different from offense. It's very close to each other, but if you really give people the idea that they have to fear for their lives, or you really just certain speeches can really affect them as people, make them feel inferior, then this is still different, I think, from something that just temporarily offends you, that irritates you, and you think, well, why are you saying this about my religion? Why are you making a mockery of it? This is offensive. Well, that's, for me, it's never a good reason to restrict speech. And your second point was about the political aspects. If a certain party has a lot of support, well, does it make sense to prohibit the speeches by these party members? That's also a thing that the Dutch courts said about Geert Wilders' speeches in the previous case. They said, well, yeah, if you have a political program as a political party, and even though it's a program that contains discrimination, that says, well, we want to expel criminal Moroccan people from the Netherlands, we don't want any new non-Western immigrants into the Netherlands, these are discriminatory proposals, of course, and they would go against every human rights treaty, blah, blah, blah. But still, to make these proposals, to speak out about this, to have this in your election program, that is still allowed. Because the freedom of political speech is very large. And I think it should be quite large, actually, especially for politicians. But at the same time, of course, they also have a lot of influence on people. What they say, whether it's in parliament or outside of parliament, they tend to, well, set the tone for how these things are talked about. So there are also dangers in it, but indeed people think these things, and there should be other ways to make them think otherwise.
Okay, last question.
Yes, about this education thing Professor said, I think it is very important. because there's an anthropological assumption, yeah, under the freedom of speech, which is the same, which is under the idea of democracy we have, and that is that in man there is something which is able to distinguish between what is, let's say, what is a useful opinion, a good opinion, a right opinion, and not. They should be educated, of course, but there is. I think we should always be on the side of the freedom. Let's say if we have to choose, because in power, in any power, there's always an opposite tendency to think that, let's say, peace and calm among the people is more promoted by some sort of exterior operation. Especially when, let's say, the idea of possibility of truth and of personal recognition of this grows less in the society. What should be educated, because any system, any power can educate into its own direction, yeah, into its own ideas. What should be educated is this capacity of man, yeah, underlying Voltaire's quote and so on, that we are able, when reading, when listening, when comparing with something in us, to distinguish between opinions. And then this, let's say, the free market of ideas, yeah, has its function. On the other side, always the more easy solution for any power, also the powers of today, is, let's say, to do this in an exterior way. But at the end, from some corner or the other of our consciousness or the society, let's say, a suppressed opinion, a suppressed partial truth eventually will come out. And I think this is more dangerous. So I completely agree with the fact that education is the most important part.
Okay, so, yes, would you like to react?
Fine.
Okay. So, thank you, everyone. And if you have any questions that you would like to ask the speakers, you can do so after we close the meeting. And, the Meet the World issue, you can take it with you home if you'd like to read it. And keep an eye out for the next one. And I also would like to announce that 2 fellow liberal arts students have a Meet the World podcast, which is on SoundCloud. So if you go to the Meet the World page on Facebook, you can find a link to it. And thank you for coming. And here are some presents for you. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. All right. Thank you for coming, and see you at the next Meet the World.